In addition to panels like we're going to enjoy tonight, Alwan has regular concerts, lecture series, book talks, film series, language classes, dance classes, music classes, a rather comprehensive mix of arts and culture and debate. Tonight's event, of course, is prescient, being on the anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution. And Alwan, as well as a few organizations, thought that it was appropriate to analyze, to discuss what had happened, what can happen, what we predict will happen, etc. into the future. Some of the organizations sponsoring tonight's event include the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association, AMIJA, NAP, the Network of Arab American Professionals, and the Ad Hoc Committee to Defend the Egyptian Revolution. We have distinguished panelists, which I shall have Khalil introduce to you. But what we're going to do is every panelist is going to have a presentation, and then we will turn it over to questions. Now, I will ask you, please, we're going to be recording this, so extraneous talk and noise is discouraged. That means turn off your cell phones, please. And when you speak and you have a question, we're going to ask you to come up to the mic and ask it. All right? So enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the second part of our panel series commemorating the start of the Egyptian Revolution. Before we begin in earnest, I'd like to briefly introduce the ad hoc coalition to defend the Egyptian Revolution, which was formed back in November following a call from Egyptian revolutionaries for Occupy movements and other solidarity movements worldwide to defend the Egyptian Revolution. So a number of activists in the New York City area responded by organizing protests denouncing the violent military regime that is now in place in Egypt. This group of activists has formalized itself, basically put a name on it, which is the Ad Hoc Coalition to Defend the Egyptian Revolution. And besides participating and organizing protests, we're trying to organize other types of events like this one, which have more of an informative or reflective role. So tonight's panel focuses on the Egyptian Army, in particular the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or the SCAF. And our speakers tonight will attempt to answer questions about, among others, the historic role of the army in Egypt, the tactics that the SCAF uses to maintain and consolidate its power, and the role of Egypt-US relations. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Professor Zach Lockman, who's a professor of Middle Eastern Islamic Studies and History at New York University. He focuses on the socioeconomic, cultural, and political history of the modern Middle East, particularly the Mashriq. His books include Workers on the Nile, Nationalism, Communism, Islam, and the Egyptian Working Class with Joel Beinin, Workers and Working Classes in the Middle East, Struggles, Histories, Historiographies, and most recently, Contending Visions of the Middle East, the History and Politics of Orientalism. Nancy Elshami is an independent journalist and researcher whose work has been featured on ZNet, Jadaliyya, and World Policy blog. Nancy has graduated from Barnard College with a bachelor's degree in economic history and Middle Eastern studies. She is currently a research analyst at Cornell University's Institute for Compensation Studies, focusing on Egyptian political economy and modern social history. Ashraf Khalil has covered the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, the Times of London, and The Economist. He worked as a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times in Baghdad and Jerusalem, and has been based in Cairo for most of the last 15 years. He is an Egyptian American and a graduate of Indiana University. His first book, Liberation Square: Inside the Egyptian Revolution and the Rebirth of a Nation, which is available right here, was recently published by St. Martin's Press this month. And Samah Selim is an assistant professor in the Department of Africa, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literature at Rutgers University. Her research focuses mainly on modern Arabic literature in Egypt and the Levant. Her book, The Novel and the Rural Imaginary in Egypt, explores the relationship between the rise of the novel genre, the politics of nationalist representation, and the present question over the course of the 20th century in Egypt. I think we'll start with Professor Lockman.
Thank you very much. It's a, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a pleasure and even more than a pleasure, an honor to be here with you on this first anniversary of the outbreak of the popular uprising that in a remarkable 18 days toppled Hosni Mubarak. It's hard to believe that it's only been a year, although on other times it seems much longer than that, of course. I am happy to call what's happened in Egypt a revolution. I believe that in some ways it is, and certainly should be. But of course, it's also possible to say that to call it a revolution, to speak of an Egyptian revolution, is really to speak of an aspiration rather than an accomplished reality, at least thus far. As we all know, the dictator is gone, but most of the dictatorship, most of the regime as it existed up till the 11th of February of last year remains in place. And of course that includes the security apparatus, which has worked very hard to reconstitute itself, to overcome the setbacks, the defeats, the humiliations it suffered in the course of the popular uprising, and has been back in the streets with, in many cases, devastating effect. Power in Egypt remains to a considerable extent in the hands of the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, a body which existed basically only on paper until the early days of February of last year. And the SCAF has displayed a remarkable combination of a capacity for repression, often very brutal repression, not hesitating to do some very horrific things to peaceful demonstrators in the streets of Cairo and other Egyptian cities. And on the other hand, a fair degree of ineptitude. It's clear that Marshal Tantawi and his colleagues, the generals who constitute the staff, the heads of various branches of the Egyptian armed forces, don't know much about governing, and they're not very good at it. So they've also lurched from policy to policy, and they've also, and this is, I think, very important, at many moments have been forced by the popular movement in the streets to backtrack. If you look at the long list of communiques, proclamations, orders that they've issued over the last 11 months or so, we can see that a lot of them have been dead letters almost from the moment they were promulgated, because they haven't had the capacity to really push them through. One example, the banning of strikes. Right? The popular uprising was bolstered in its last weeks by a massive outpouring of worker support, of strikes, of demonstrations, an explosion of formation of unions, a tremendous pent-up desire by working people who had been beaten down, whose wages had been dropped over the previous years and decades, to organize themselves, to demand their rights, to demand social justice more broadly. And this resulted in a wave of strikes, which the regime has been, the SCAF has been unable to suppress. It's made efforts in various places, it's been successful in some instances, but by and large that energy continues to be felt despite all sorts of decrees. Now, Egypt is entering a new period now. The lower house, the elections for the lower house of parliament, the People's Assembly, have been completed. Elections for the upper house, whose status and duties have always been a little bit vague, will take place shortly, and then down the road a bit, elections for a new president. And this means that a new stage of struggles is about to begin, because the new parliament will have as one of its chief tasks, perhaps its chief task, the drafting of a new constitution, and ultimately, at some months down the road, a civilian government responsible to a parliament in keeping with this new constitution will be in place. The SCAF has said that it will step down from power, and it may well, at least in terms of abdicating its formal role as the supreme arbiter of power in Egypt. On the other hand, it's pretty clear that the field marshal and the generals would very much like to preserve their privileged status, very much hope that they can get away with institutionalizing their power behind the scenes. And the struggle over the next 6 months, year, perhaps beyond, will be whether they can get away with this or not. Now, the dominant political force as a result of the elections, the Muslim Brothers, have a very long history of enduring repression at the hands of Egyptian regimes going back to 1954, going back much earlier, in fact, into the 1940s, but certainly from the consolidation of the Nasser regime. It's a very cautious movement. This is their great moment that they've been hoping and dreaming of for a very long time, when they actually have a chance at assuming power. But it's also a movement that was propelled to power by this popular uprising. And it's a movement whose leadership is feeling its way. It has its own divisions. It has different constituencies it has to answer to. So the question of whether the Muslim Brothers will seek to cut a deal with the military, allowing the military, the command of the military, when I speak of the army, I mean these top commanders, because the military is not one institution, and we need to keep that in mind, will cut some kind of deal, or will be propelled from below to push for democracy. This is one of the key questions of the period ahead. Now, the military as an institution has a very long history in Egypt, and in many ways has been central to the formation of Egypt as a modern state, and enjoys, or has enjoyed at least, a fair degree of legitimacy as a key institution of the nation state. If we go back to the figure who is depicted in the historiography of Egypt as the founder of modern Egypt, we can see that one of his key preoccupations was the formation of a modern military apparatus. Right? Muhammad Ali, who is not himself Egyptian, of course, who is of Albanian origin, but came to Egypt in the very first years of the 19th century with an Ottoman force sent to retake Egypt from the French forces under Napoleon, who had occupied it, then made himself the basically autonomous, almost independent ruler of Egypt, despite the fact that Egypt was nominally still part of the Ottoman Empire. And one of the very first things he tried to do was build up a modern army in order to secure control of Egypt for himself and what he hoped would be the dynasty that he would found. And it was this effort to create an army that propelled many of the very dramatic social, institutional transformations that Egypt underwent in the first half of the 19th century. If you want a modern army, you need to train officers, you need military schools, you need to train doctors, you have medical schools, you need engineers, engineering schools, importing advisors from abroad, importing equipment, but increasingly trying to produce it locally. It set off a series of transformations that were central to the formation of the modern Egyptian state. Now, he's often depicted as a great reformer, the person who brings all these enlightened reforms to Egypt. But of course, from the perspective of the Egyptian masses, many of these things were not good, right? Because one of the things Muhammad Ali does is introduce conscription, forcing people who had never before been subject to conscription to serve under often horrific conditions in the military, sometimes for years on end. And a great many people who were drafted into the military never got home again. And of course, a massive exploitation of the country's human resources in order to pay for all this development, all this state building, which benefited Muhammad Ali and the dynasty and the new social groups that that were able to take advantage of this, but often meant a much worse life for the great mass of peasants and poor urban population. And it also was accompanied by a degree of expansion. Right? Muhammad Ali went off and conquered Syria from the Ottomans, and he conquered the Sudan to create a sort of mini empire for himself. Not something that the Sudanese would have very good memories of down the road. Nonetheless, this set in motion social changes that would be central to the emergence of an Egyptian national identity. Egypt would be occupied by British military forces in 1882 and would remain under British occupation in one form or another into the 1950s. At least British troops remained on Egyptian soil down to 1955. And the British occupied Egypt because a group of Egyptian army officers of authentic Egyptian origin began demanding a say in their country's government on behalf of much wider sections of the Egyptian population. And to forestall this, to reassert control, to make sure that the bondholders who owned the Egyptian public debt would get their money back, Egypt occupied the country and would retain a grip on it for many years to come. The British did their best to reduce the size of the army. They were not interested in any large military establishment given their experience at the onset of the occupation. And even after Egypt won limited independence in 1922, the army remained relatively small. But one of the first things that the new government in Egypt did after a treaty was signed in 1936 with Britain that allowed for a much greater measure of independence was to begin to build up the armed forces and more specifically to open the military academy to middle-class Egyptians, to the sons of middle-class families. Previously, the ranks of the officer corps had been dominated by people from the Turco-Circassian caste, the very upper class, people connected to the monarchy, the nobility, the large landowners. And so it was that in 1936, 37, 38, you get these young men, often very patriotic, having been involved in the struggle for a fuller degree of independence, increasingly aware of the grave social problems and social inequities that Egypt suffered from, who entered the military academy because this offers them some hope for social mobility. And it's just these cohorts, the people who entered the military academy in the late 1930s, who will seize power in 1952. Having experienced the corruption, the bankruptcy of the monarchy, having fought in Palestine in 1948, having been sent off poorly equipped, poorly trained, poorly led by a government which got into this without much forethought or planning, decided that their moment had come to do something different. And in 1952, they overthrow the king, later abolish the monarchy, and set Egypt on a new course, of course led by the young Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now this generation would dominate the Egyptian state for an entire period, for 20 years or so. They took off their uniforms. You don't see after the first couple of years Nasser in his military uniform anymore. But if you look at the personnel who are the ministers who occupy key positions in the civilian government, a great many of them are former colonels, majors, etc., who are part of the free officers movement or take over these positions afterward. In the early 1960s, the great Egyptian Marxist Anwar Abdul Malik, who had been living in exile for a very long time, published a book, which is still worth reading, called Egypt Military Society. And it was one of the best analyses of Nasser's Egypt up to that point. And he called it military society, not because he thought the society was so thoroughly militarized, but because he was trying to come to grips, among other things, with the fact that this state seemed to be dominated by army officers. And this had certain manifestations in the sense that, and we can see perhaps a little bit of this in the SCAF, right? These were people who were used to giving orders. Right? These were not civilians, they were not civilian politicians. And although the Nasser regime carried out a range of social reforms, land reform, that led to real increases in the standard of living for broad sections of the population, including poorer sections of the population, this was done in a thoroughly top-down manner. Nasser established an authoritarian one-party state, which didn't hesitate to use a great deal of repression against its enemies, real and imagined. And these two things went together. They went together relatively successfully up to a certain point, of course, until the defeat in 1967, which discredited the regime and this particular model of authoritarian populist developmentalism. Even after Nasser's death in 1970, the regime continued to be led by military men, right? Anwar Sadat had been one of the free officers who came to power with Nasser in 1952. And in many ways, his legitimacy was built on the fact that he had overseen what Egyptians perceived as a successful military operation against Israel in the 1973 war. And he, in turn, was succeeded by the commander of the Air Force, Hosni Mubarak, who Sadat had made his vice president. Both Sadat and even more so Mubarak just no longer ruled through military men. The military had its own particular domain. It got all sorts of benefits. Its budget basically escaped oversight. And as all of you know, the Egyptian military controls a very large chunk of the Egyptian economy. Industrial plants, land deals, on and on. And again, the rank and file soldiers don't benefit from this, but the top officers do and gain a lot of clout from controlling these segments of the economy, even though the state itself or other sections of the state are run largely by civilian technocrats of one kind or another, or people politically connected through the apparatus of the former ruling party, the National Democratic Party. And it's this privileged position, the absence of any civilian oversight, the fact that no one really knows what happens to the billions of dollars in American aid that get funneled into the military, where they end up, what they're used for. This is something which the generals presumably know, but Egyptians by and large, and even those in the civilian side of the state often don't. And this will be a critical question in the period ahead. And whether the SCAF will be able to get away with entrenching this political position, despite the fact that we had that Egypt experienced this popular uprising that overthrew the dictator, whether they'll be able to preserve the position they've enjoyed over the last several decades. The SCAF is counting on the widespread desire, a genuine desire among many Egyptians for stability. There are certainly Egyptians who are tired of protests. On the other hand, there's also a genuine desire for change and for a thorough transition to democracy, a genuine transition to democracy, a pressure from below. And the fate of Egypt, in a sense, will be hanging in the balance over the period ahead, with some very critical choices to be made. In these days, the Egyptian government is negotiating again with the International Monetary Fund. Now, Egypt was one of the models praised in December of 2010 by the IMF for its exemplary implementation of structural adjustment and so on. The very policies that impoverished millions of Egyptians and that produced a lot of the energy that brought people into the streets in January and February and continue to fuel a desire for change. Right? Egypt is in an extremely difficult economic situation at the moment, with tourism down drastically and foreign investment having diminished drastically and so on, and prices rising very quickly, and there's a tremendous amount of frustration about it. And the question is whether this will be channeled in ways that further the democratic project and the project of social justice, because the two will need to go together. A democratic government will need to address the real, genuine grievances of the great mass of Egyptians who have suffered from a disastrously unsuccessful set of economic policies pushed from abroad to a large extent by the Washington Consensus with the blessing of the United States. The New York Times is still editorializing even in the last days about how Egypt needs to carry these reforms even further, which means further impoverishment for a great many Egyptians, or a democratic movement in whatever configuration will find other ways to mobilize to continue to put pressure to undermine the continued power or the effort by the SCAF and its allies to entrench their power in whatever form and find a new direction forward which offers some hope of realizing the aspirations of the millions of people who took to the streets beginning a year ago today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll turn to Nancy Elshami. Thank you. Can you all hear me? I'm honored to be here today, and I feel very humbled by my fellow panelists, but hopefully I can offer you a productive discussion today. And thinking back on 1 year since the Egyptian Revolution, just last year, last February, I was on a similar panel talking about the Egyptian Revolution, and it was very funny. I was talking to one of my fellow panelists, and I was like, "Can you believe that we're here today?" And he was like, "No, but neither did," or "Could you have imagined that we would be here today?" And he said, "No, but neither did the CIA, and that's what's so great about this." But I think we can all rest assured that the CIA is very interested in what's going on in Egypt now. But thinking back 1 year since the revolution, one of the things that I find really interesting and have been very striking this past year is the change in attitudes of the people towards the military. And I'd just like to preface my discussion with the fact that I'll be using the term military and army and SCAF interchangeably, and there is a distinction, as Professor Lockman has mentioned. And back in January and February, during the beginning of this revolution, it was so interesting for me to see that one of the most overwhelming chants in Tahrir and in protests in New York City supporting Tahrir are that the army and the people are one hand, or these invocations of the army's name, or of even the Field Marshal Tantawi's name as a protector of the people and as a savior of the revolution. There was a chant saying, "Oh Marshal, they're killing your children in Tahrir." And when I was in Egypt in December, participating in one of the women's marches against the Supreme Council, you find protesters now using the same chants that were used against Mubarak and his family, except this time against the army, and demanding an end to military rule, and even demanding the execution of the field marshal. And I think that this change in attitudes throughout this past year can tell us a lot, not just about the trajectory of the revolution and where it's headed, but also is very telling as to what the military's role was at right before the revolution, and how the military's role has changed since the 1952 revolution, and what role it's played in Egyptian politics and economics. And I think what we really see happening this past year is an unraveling of this idealistic, nationalistic facade of the Egyptian military. And we see laid bare the fact that the military, or the SCAF, is just another side to the Mubarak coin. And we see that the military is very interested in maintaining the status quo and very interested in affecting as little change as possible. And I think that one of the questions that I was very interested in is, why were Egyptians so welcoming of the military on February 11th, or at least a majority of Egyptians, and how can we perceive the military's role throughout the history of Egypt in nationalist discourse and in political and economic discourse? And even though Professor Lockman provided us with a very insightful view of the history of the Egyptian military, I'd like to go back to certain points that I think are worthwhile in telling us how the military, or how the Egyptian military has defined and redefined itself in Egyptian society. And I think that examining that can tell us a little more about why people's attitudes were the way they were on February 11th, and how or why they changed. And the first point I'd like to go back to is 1952 with Gamal Abdel Nasser and his revolution. And it's kind of ironic
just as an offside point, when you think of the 1952 revolution, whether you perceive it as a revolution or a coup, that once that revolution took place, all structures of the former regime were uprooted and complete new social and political and economic structures were put down. And even though this was a very small group of officers that took over the country, it was a top-down revolution, as Professor Lockman had said, they were able to create radical change in the country, which is unfortunately something that the popular revolution in Egypt is struggling to achieve. So we see in 1952, when Gamal Abdel Nasser takes power, a welcoming of this idea of a more powerful and a more sovereign and dignified Egyptian army. And I think that we can attribute that to Egypt's defeat in 1948, a very shameful defeat. And underlying that defeat in 1948 was a lot of implications of government corruption, of ministers and government officials striking faulty arms deals for their own personal gain, or also underlying it is a lack of true sovereignty in the Egyptian state. And at this point in history is where we see Egyptian nationalism really becoming intertwined with the army and the Egyptian state becoming one, so that loyalty to Egypt is equal to loyalty to the Egyptian army and to a strong and powerful Egyptian army. And we see the army gaining this privileged state in the Egyptian society, and we see the army officers becoming this new class of ruling elite. And the army maintains this privileged status throughout the Nasser regime, even though the Nasser regime was delegitimized by the 1967 defeat. The Egyptian people still maintained this desire for a strong army to regain its legitimacy and to regain Sinai, and that was achieved in 1973. But with 1973, we find a new important point in the trajectory of the Egyptian military. With this shift in alliances between Egyptian Soviet alliances to Egyptian US alliances, and the advent of open door policy. And at this point in history, it's where we begin to see this distancing of the army from the front lines of governing, from the front lines of policy making. And this is when the army has to start to share power with this rising class of crony capitalists close to the Sadat regime. And that really solidifies, I think, with the 1979 Camp David peace treaty. Up until that point, the Egyptian military state had legitimized itself and had defined itself as a protecting power against Israel. And with this peace treaty, that kind of identity could no longer be sustained. That kind of identity could no longer be sustained, and rather the Egyptian military rescinded from the front lines of governing into building this economic enterprise that it has sustained throughout the past 30 years, and it's maintained its military legacy through the October 6th victory of 1973 that it has propagated and galvanized throughout the past 30 years as maintaining this nationalistic, strong, legitimizing image of the Egyptian army. And at the same time, since 1979, instead of being in front lines of government or policy making, through subsidies and through land grants and through all of these privileges, the Egyptian military has been able to build an almost autonomous enterprise that can affect Egyptian politics, can affect Egyptian economics, can affect Egyptian society. And you'll find the military everywhere, from coastal resorts to hotels to industries to to every aspect of the Egyptian economy. And even though the military is not at the forefront, it is still very much a military society. It is the army is the largest and most powerful institution in the country. And even with the advent of privatization, when we see that the Mubarak government, rather than being retired army officers, is now he is now comprised mostly of businessmen, the army still maintains a very privileged status and has that ability to veto any policies that it sees threatening to this economic enterprise. And some estimates put the army enterprise at holding 20 to 40% of the Egyptian economy. And of course, all of that is unchecked power, unchecked budget. You cannot audit the Egyptian army, not just in cases of military budget, but in all of its commercial activities as well. And you cannot write about the Egyptian army without a permit in Egypt. So you have this very obscure nature to the military institution, but you have still in the Egyptian psyche this nationalistic perception of the 1973 army, the October 6th army that regained Sinai, and that has sustained this loyalty and nationalism to the army throughout those past 30 years. Since 1973, the army had not been deployed into the Egyptian streets, but for 2 times, I think, and that was once in 1977 during the bread riots under Sadat regime, where they were deployed to maintain order, and when subsidies were reinstated, and again in 2008 during Egypt's bread crisis, when soldiers had to distribute bread to the bakeries to quell the unrest. So on February 11th, 2011, you have this image of the Egyptian soldier as the strong and loyal and nationalistic Egyptian soldier of 1973, and you have the image of the army that has maintained stability and maintained stability throughout the past 30 years, and is not, in the Egyptian psyche at the time, synonymous with the Mubarak regime that has oppressed them and has been corrupt for the past 30 years. And since February 11th, we see that facade or that kind of perception come apart. And we've seen that the military has largely tried to effect as little change as possible, and all of the military's concessions throughout this past year have largely been reactionary concessions, small concessions trying to avert a large protest or trying to divide protesters among themselves, whether it's getting rid of Ahmed Shafiq or Hassan Sharaf, or whether it is setting forth a timeline. All of these were very reactionary concessions. And at the same time, people have seen that the army is using the same tactics as the Mubarak regime to quell the uprisings, to quell protests, to maintain things precisely as they are. Whether it's through the state media or these implications that there are foreign forces moving these protesters in Tahrir or these people who are striking, or whether it is through violence and physically oppressing the protesters, or whether it's through virginity checks of female protesters, it's precisely out of Mubarak's game plan throughout the 18 days of the initial Egyptian revolution. And and at this point, I think the millions of people that came out in Tahrir today are proof enough that Egyptians have realized that the Egyptian military is one and the same as the Mubarak regime, and they have the same interests. And I'd like to second what Professor Lockman was saying, that I don't particularly feel that the military wants to be in the forefront of politics and government. They were very comfortable affecting power and affecting politics and economics from behind the scenes. But I think that if they feel that their privileged position is threatened, they will continue to try to be in the forefront if that's what needs to happen. But I think that moving forward, the focus has to be not just on getting a civilian government in power, but really restructuring the power dynamic and the privileges that the army has in Egyptian society. Having a civilian government in power that will have the same symbiotic relationship that the Mubarak regime had with the SCAF is not going to have the results that the protesters want. What really needs to happen is a restructuring of that relationship. And while that's going to be very difficult with an institution so powerful like the army, I think that there is some hope from the bottom up. And we've seen that protests have gained concessions, and continued protests have gained concessions that might not have come forth if protests had ended on February 11th. But I also think that there's a lot of hope through all of these independent labor unions that have sparked up, and through this renewed political awareness of the Egyptian people. Thank you.
Well, I guess first off, I'd like to say how thrilled I am at the turnout tonight. This is amazing. I mean, that I really wasn't sure what to expect. But my hats off to Amija and to NAP, to the Network of Arab American Professionals. These are both organizations that I've been involved with for a couple of years, and this is just a fantastic event. So I'm really pleased to be here. Yes, give yourselves a hand. This is great. ارفع راسك فوق بقى يعني. So I guess one of the things I remember the most about, I covered the revolution pretty much every day of it last year, and I remember walking to Tahrir Square in the evening of January 28th, around 10 o'clock at night. I had been covering the protests until about 5 or 6 in the evening. The battle was raging on Asr Nile Bridge, and I had to go find a computer and an internet connection, which was harder than you can imagine in a place with no internet. But I managed to figure something out and start filing my stories. By about 10 o'clock at night, I was off deadline. Tahrir had fallen, the NDP was in flames, and I started walking across the deserted October 6th bridge. And all I knew was that Mubarak had called out the military, and I didn't know what that meant or how they would be dealt with or how they would act or how they'd be reacted to. And I'm raised in America. I'm not raised in Egypt. I did not serve in the military, so I was not aware of people's attitudes towards them. And it was a real shock to me. I mean, I thought it would be a much tenser situation, and what I saw was this kind of festive atmosphere. These people that had been throwing Molotov cocktails at the police a couple of hours earlier were like posing for pictures on the tanks. And generally having a really good time. And I watched like these extremely patient tank commanders. Like, there's kids sort of having a party on their tank and posing for pictures, and the guy's kind of making the wrap it up sign to them. And I was amazed at how incredibly patient the army was, and that was really my first experience with this deep respect that people had for the army. I mean, I didn't quite understand it, I didn't quite share it, but I had to acknowledge that it was there. And I think and I've always been very curious about where that came from. We've seen it erode over the past year for obvious and well-deserved reasons, but I mean, one of my theories is not just that everybody did their time in military service. There's also a thing, my father emigrated to the US in the late 60s, and he was a hardcore Nasserist who kind of lost the faith when he saw how Nasser actually ran the country prior to, and then 67 really kind of, drove him out of the country. And But he says that back in Nasser's day, it wasn't the police that was rounding you up from your home and torturing you. It was the army. You know, they were the SOBs back then. And it's just kind of this quirk of history that the Interior Ministry and the police became ascendant, especially in Mubarak's time, and they became the torturers, and they became the out-of-control gang. But one of the things we've seen, since February 11th, and really the cracks were obvious even during the revolution. You know, I remember during February 2nd, the Battle of Tahrir, you know, the camel battle that it's called, for lack of a better term. And people really, the army their actions were deeply suspicious on that day. I mean, they kind of let people go in and didn't really make any move to separate the two sides. And, you know, there were people that I interviewed who their faith in the army began to crack on that day. Many people still held it, though. As of February 11th, I remember a good friend of mine, Hossam Hamalawi, who's a very prominent activist and an online presence and a real kind of hardcore revolutionary socialist firebrand. I give him credit. On February 11th, he was on TV saying, "I do not trust these generals and no one else should." And he was in the minority. But I think, you know, the last year or so speaks well for his point of view. One thing I want to point out is that the huge turnout in the parliamentary elections, don't confuse that with faith in the military. I think it was really surreal being in Egypt in November, December, because you had massive, violent, deadly protests. And a week later and 3 blocks away, you had a packed polling station. It was, it was such an incredible disconnect. And I think that a lot of Egyptians are just so weary of all of this and so desperate for something that's going to move them forward to the next stage, and they're hoping that these elections will just get us forward. And unfortunately, that weariness is translating into a real lack of appetite for further protests and further street violence and further street action, which is a shame, because these street violence, the street action is the only thing that has produced any concessions so far. You know, that is, you can go with a calendar and just mark major protest and major, not just protest, but violence, major concession. I mean, the clashes in November and early December were hugely unpopular in Egypt. And it pains me to say that. They did not have the backing of the country.